you. My name is Sean Capstick. I work with Gold Associates. I lead our technical community, which is a knowledge sharing practice about sustainability and climate change. And I'm very excited to share with you the work that I've been doing with the Mining Association of Canada for the last about 18 months. We've been working on developing a guidance document that looks at the physical risks, the adaptation, climate change effects of a changing climate on the project. So what I want to do is walk you through some of the drivers, why MAC worked through this, what we did to develop the guidance, and then how this guidance can be implemented to help make decisions around the risks of a changing climate. So for those people who don't know who the Mining Association of Canada is, it's the national voice of mining. There's a large overlap of members with this group. And one of the things that MAC does is promote the Towards Sustainable Mining, or TSM program, which looks at how mines can operate sustainability and manage their environmental impacts responsibly. So this program has gone out on a number of areas, again, overlap in terms of tailings, surveillance, greenhouse gases, and part of their process is they have a community of interest panel that advises them on this TSM process. So the COI panel meets twice a year. They look at priorities, feedback in terms of how the TSM program is being implemented, and look at how companies are implementing the TSM. As part of their review, they issued a challenge to MAC and said, you're doing work in terms of the greenhouse gas, climate change, you've got work on tailings, but what you don't have is an overriding process to look at how a changing climate can affect all of the TSM documents. So they issued this call to action and identified climate change adaptation as a priority for TSM. At the same time, here in Canada, our Natural Resources Department in the federal government was promoting climate change adaptation across many sectors, and they had a call for proposals to look at developing a climate change guidance, best practices in a group of sectors. So Golder and MAC, we got together, proposed this process under NRCan, and with their assistance and contributions from the MAC members, we've got to this process. So what have we done so far, and what's going to happen? So we formed a steering committee of MAC members, so large mining companies that are operating here in Canada and globally, including Suncor, Glencore, Vale, Goldcorp, Teck, and Agnico Eagle, and they formed our steering committee to say how the guidance document should be put forward. We looked at some subject matter experts in terms of what the technical issues are. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We were looking for how can we incorporate these best practices internationally, and we wanted to link to the regulatory guidance that's available in Canada, but also internationally. Although this document is part of TSM and is written for Canadian operators, TSM has been adopted by many countries around the world, and operators are using this process internationally. So although when this document comes out after the next MAC board meeting, it has a Canadian flavor, but it is very much could be applicable anywhere in the world. So let's talk about in addition to TSM, the document has a number of other uses, there's other drivers for using the document. And I've just outlined three here. We're seeing globally, the regulators and other stakeholders are asking mining clients to demonstrate how they've considered a changing climate as part of their mine operations, whether it is at the planning stage as part of an impact assessment, whether it is part of an operating permit, or whether it's part of closure and the closure planning. So we worked with, here in Canada, our impact assessment agency to make sure that this process was going to be consistent with the emerging guidance that's around that process. It is consistent with other guidance documents from other regulators or stakeholders. The Equator Principles, for example, speak to a lot of these issues around these physical risks. And we're working with here in Canada. The Yukon is developing territorial specific guidance for their gold mining sector, and this will very much fit into complement that type of approach that we're working with the Yukon right now on. The other aspect that I think is very important is professional practice. The World Association of Engineering and various local engineering regulators have said climate change is part of engineering and geoscience. So if you are doing this type of work as a professional, then you have to say how you've incorporated climate change as part of your design and work. So if you're an engineer of record at a site, then this guidance will also help inform how you are considering the physical and chemical stability of the site, for example. And then I think the final area, and what is really being a fast emerging requirement, is the stakeholders and investor interest. So the task force on climate-related financial disclosure, it speaks to this type of a risk assessment, looking at how the physical risks, acute and chronic impacts can affect a company's operations. So there are a lot of mining companies that are supporters of the TCFD, and this guidance is not written exactly for TCFD. It's more of an operational aspect, but certainly the considerations within the guidance can be part of that story for the disclosure of how the physical risks can affect your operations. So let's get into the guidance. What does it say? Well, as a snapshot, we looked at this as a three-stage process. And the guidance provides a framework, but is not a prescriptive approach that every site has to do this explicitly. What it says is if you're going through this process, then you should be able to speak to how you have documented at each of these stages. So there's a climate risk assessment, looking at how the current and the future trends interact with the mine infrastructure and the surrounding area around the mine, the community of interest around the mine, looking at vulnerabilities and identifying risks. So at the end of the first stage, you have some prioritization and understanding of where current weather and changes in the expected weather are likely to impact the operations. So you've got some priorities. In the decision analysis, you look at the various adaptation options, how you can reduce that risk, and make some form of a decision-making process so it is defensible, documented, and transparent to these community of interests of why you have made these decisions. And then the final stage is implementation and surveillance, is where you are going to monitor the implementation of these adaptation options, look for triggers to when the adaptation that you've deferred to sometime in the future is going to be implemented, and monitor for changes. Climate change is not static. There will be new projections that are available through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They release assessment reports every 7 years. We're expecting assessment report 6, AR6, to come out next year. That will be necessary as part of a continuous improvement process for this. And you can see in this slide that as new data or as the mine changes, as the mine plan is being implemented, then this is a continuous improvement process. So let's unpack the steps a little bit further. So when do you consider a climate change in terms of your decision-making process? And the answer, quite clearly from the members, is at all times. At the planning, design, operations, and closure, climate change is important. But the level of information that's available at a planning stage and a pre-feasibility or feasibility stage is much different than at an operating mine. So the guidance talks about how the level of information must be appropriate to the stage of the project life cycle. And it talks about vulnerabilities. One of the things that we heard from the members is this should fit into the existing risk process that is currently applied through the risk register at sites. So we introduced the concept of vulnerability and then assess the risk of that vulnerability. So let's look at two vulnerabilities that could be affected by a changing climate. So if you have a containment structure that relies on frozen ground, then permafrost degradation could change the risk, could affect that vulnerability. If you have a spillway that's designed for a certain rainfall event, then changes in those high intensity precipitation events could also change the risk of that vulnerability. So the vulnerabilities exist, and we're looking at how climate change could be affecting that level of risk. So we've used I think everybody's familiar with a heat map, and how risk is based on the consequence and the probability. And so using that process, then you can help to develop these prioritizations. And the guidance very much says use the risk approach that is available for the operator. And various operators are going to have very different levels of risk, whether you're a multinational operator that has sites all over the world, or whether you have one mine and you're operating that. Your level of risk is going to be very different, but the framework will be the same. So we're not being prescriptive in terms of what is an acceptable risk. It's to develop that based on your risk register. It does talk about future climate. And when we talk about the future climate, there's uncertainty. We have the benefit of these projections that I mentioned from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, various research organizations globally, data portals that are available globally. But it's very important to understand what that uncertainty is with projections, and that there's uncertainty in the baseline. Mines are often located not close to long-term climate stations. They're in remote areas on the tops of mountains. And so the baseline, the existing conditions, also has uncertainty. The projections have another layer of uncertainty, and it's very important in terms of how you're documenting this process is that you understand and explain that uncertainty. So let's talk about how climate change can affect an acceptable level of risk, and how design has gone on in the past and how it has to change moving forward. So if you had a load a certain rainfall intensity over a specified return period, a 1 in 100-year storm, for example, then your design capacity would be higher. And so, that is a safety margin. You have a resilient design. What is a common understanding now is the future is uncertain. So that future load may not be based on the historical observations, the load, the 1 in 100-year observed conditions. It could change in the future. And where that risk is unacceptable is where that future load is greater than that design capacity. And this concept of stationary design, that using climatology data provided by a government agency is no longer an acceptable standard of care. And now we've got to incorporate that uncertainty moving forward. And so it's that gap under the future conditions that the document helps to identify. So the difference between the risk assessment that owners do right now and a climate change risk assessment is that change in the probability is going to may occur over some time. So there has to be some decision, some support in terms of when these adaptation options are going to implement. And there could be many different adaptation options that would be applicable to a site. So this stage 2 looks at how you document that process. The terminology cost benefit is, again, easy to understand. Is it better to invest in this adaptation now or wait in the future when you have more information? And is the cost of coping greater than the cost of adapting? That concept is easy to understand. It isn't just about costs. The risks that could be identified under this risk assessment process could have health and safety and environment. The sphere of influence is not just within the mine, it is including the community of interest. So this concept of a multi-criteria analysis is also discussed. It's going to be up to the operator to figure out which process they use to define and justify their decision process. So you can see how it links together in this figure. There's a change in risk. You could say, we're not going to do anything right now. It's business as usual. It's an acceptable risk. Both the current and the future risks probabilities are within our risk tolerance. You can say we're going to wait and gather more information. Could be a further refinement in terms of the data that's available, both in terms of the projections and in terms of the risk. Or we might say, hey, we'll just take action right now. If we're designing something and we can easily increase resilience at a low cost, or it's something you were going to do anyway, it's a no regrets adaptation, maybe you take action now and then you're resilient for a long period of time in the future. So another way of looking at this, is there's different pathways, and it could be, these steps could be thought about as the mine plan implements, and as you move through stage 1, stage 2 into closure, you may have another decision-making process at each stage, or as new information is available. So very important under the implementation and surveillance phase is, well, when do you take action? If you have said, we're going to wait, we're going to refine, we're going to collect information and do it in the future, how do you identify that? How does that be transparent to the community of interest? And how are you going to document that process? So this concept of thresholds or triggers, a time emergent signal, is discussed and is part of that implementation and surveillance. It's a continuous improvement process. So and that fits into, again, other TSM documents and the way operators, owners, run their process in terms of the ISO and other continuous improvement improvement processes at the site. So let's look at a simple trigger. So ground temperature. There are a number of case studies in the document, and this is taken from the adaptation remediation plan that is being undertaken at the Giant Mine in Canada's north. So that adaptation option, their closure plan, relies on freeze back of the ground and underground curtailment of arsenic materials and other materials that could pose a problem to groundwater or surface water. So they have designed a process where the ground temperature is monitored through thermistors, and they have trigger levels, so they could put in thermosiphons to improve the freeze back and get better heat transfer. And that if those aren't sufficient, then they could put in active cooling that would further promote freeze back. And they have done various analysis under the climate change projections that we provided, and that freeze back is inputted into their models, and they're also going to be able to look at these trigger levels to take further action. It gets a little bit more complicated in that containment structure example for the water or the spillway, because right now it's designed on a return period, a risk process. And what you have to monitor in the future is that change in the level of risk. So is that the depth and the frequency that depth is likely to occur, right now is an acceptable, say, 1 in 1,000 year event, or for a tailings process, a PMP event. Is that event likely to change? So is the PMP in the future going to increase in depth, and does that pose an unacceptable risk to your design? So that's a little bit more complicated in terms of how that's going to be monitored, but the idea still is the same. I hope you can see that it's setting up a process where you've identified a priority, you've made some decision about when you're going to take action, and then you have the implementation and surveillance where you're going to monitor whether those actions are sufficient or when they have to be implemented if you've deferred that process. So the status of the document right now is we've had a series of both internal MAC members and external comments. We're incorporating those comments. It will go back to the steering committee, and then at the next MAC meeting, which is scheduled for November, then it can be formally adopted into a TSM document and available on the website. But the document has been widely circulated through MAC members. So I think that, at this point, a lot of the ideas can be considered a working draft. And I know that, the clients that we're working with right now, are implementing these ideas right now, and that's what shaped the guidance document. So that'll end what I wanted to present, and we have time for questions.
We do, and that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you. So if anybody has a question, you can either raise your hand and we can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself, or you can use the chat to ask a question. So with that, any questions for Sean? Surely there's got to be one. Looks like you've got off pretty easy, Sean.
I have a question. This is Jatine. Hey, Sean, just curious, what's the timeline on sort of finish this work, and how would that actually get incorporated into the current towards sustainable mining sets of documents?
Okay, so we've issued a number of drafts to MAC members, and those have been coming back for comments. So the plan is that we will finalize this as a final draft that maybe that will be available to MAC members, but not as an official document that is on the MAC website. To be posted onto the MAC website, it has to be accepted by the MAC board, and the next board meeting is scheduled in November. So I think that is when it will be widely publicly available. MAC has to translate it into French, but there will be, that there are, the document, has been circulated to the Environment and Science Committee, so it's out to many, many MAC members. Does that help? It's not an official document, but it very much is a working draft, as I said.
Yeah, thanks.
We have another question for you, Sean. Are we collaborating with building code authorities to develop future loads?
So, the work that in Canada that is being done by NRCan is looking at building loads, and there are a number of Canadian Standard Association or other standard organization documents for loads. They are referenced in this document, and that's part of is it an acceptable risk? If we design it to a standard for a building, then is that an acceptable risk? So that's going to be something that an owner has to make a decision on. But when you're looking at the mine infrastructure or conflicting water demands from the community and from the mine, those are the codes are not as appropriate in those areas. It's more for built infrastructure. So that was, again, one of how we identified one of the needs for this document.
Excellent. We have another question from Connie. How are the timelines typically for getting approvals for climate adoption mitigation technologies that are unproven?
So I would challenge maybe that they're unproven. Mines are built around the world, from the Arctic to the equator. And so there is no climate that prevents a mine from being developed anywhere. It's understanding the expected climate and making sure that the mine design and operations are appropriate for that. And so, that's the climate change, right? That's the idea of, you can't look at historic information and say, we expect that to be true for the life of the mine and into closure. So it's understanding what you are likely to expect and then designing for that. So I don't think it's the technologies are, appropriate. It's understanding what is going to be expected. And there may be opportunities, moving forward too, that under a changing climate, there may be better rehabilitation or closure options than were available under historical climate. So, there's other opportunities that climate change can put in there. I focused on the risks, and the examples were, risks, but it's looking at how is this mine going to design and operate based on the current conditions and the future conditions. So I would really think it's there's anything unproven here. It's just making sure that what is going to be expected and document those assumptions, so you understand how the mine was prepared and what the tolerances, those triggers, and those thresholds are for the mine.
Excellent. We have another question from Camilla. Would you say that the methodology for identifying climate change risks in your work is in line with the TCFD requirements? I'm not sure if I know that acronym, but or will there be any differences?
So TCFD is, that is, I liken it to more of a story at first in terms of what the disclosure is. You know, you're looking at your governance, your financial risks, your transitional risks, and then this physical risk aspect. So the how that's going to affect a company and whether the company has got, you know, national company that has mines all over the world, or whether it has one mine, that story is going to be very different. As I said, this guidance is more focused on an operator, a single mine, but the process very much can be used to refine that story. So if you were saying, you know, the company X, we've got mines all over the world, and we have done this assessment at each of our mines, we are identifying the high priorities, and we've got a implementation and surveillance plan in place, I think you would have a very clear statement under TCFD to say that you understand and are dealing with your physical risks. So do you see how this is a building block? You know, TCFD really is an overarching program, and I see this guidance fitting in as one of the things that you would do under TCFD.
Excellent. We have another question from Sebnub. Are there any plans for developing guidelines for the selection of the right climate change model and the resampling to sites? And their resampling to sites, sorry.
So that is in the guidance, it speaks to understanding the uncertainty of the global circulation models and the regional circulation models that are available through these various climate portals. You know, I'll use the Canadian example. We have the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, and we have a data portal, climatedata.ca. It has a wealth of information. You can get projections to a 10 square kilometer basis on a daily for temperature and precipitation and some other climate variables. So there's lots of information out there. It's understanding that information and how it fits in that risk assessment process and how it's going to trigger further action that really is the important part. So, you know, climate science is changing. It's getting better all the time. The information that we had available, you know, 5 years ago was not as spatially or temporally refined, but you know, companies still had to make decisions. That part is getting better. It's what the guidance really focuses on, and I think the important thing when you're talking about climate change is uncertainty and understanding your risk process. So as you get more information, you can decide, does that mean I have to take action, or am I still on this adaptation pathway that I developed as part of my original process? So it's, you know, the models are integral to this process, but it's to inform the risk process. I don't think the models are driving it as much as the companies, the owners' risk process at the sites.
Excellent. And one last question: you know, and this is probably a general question, but it's got something that's fairly specific. So this is from Roos. So how does climate change, from your perspective, impact the mining industry, and in particular, tailings dams design?
So it's with the, you know, increased focus on tailings, you know, and the importance of proper operation of tailings, then the design aspects are also part of that review. You know, the most important thing for tailings is proper operation and you know, operating maintenance and surveillance. So, you know, that's the most important thing in terms of tailings. Climate change is another consideration, but the the fact that tailings are typically designed for the most extreme events based on historical information means that they have a level of resilience moving forward. So is PMP likely to change in the future under a warmer future? Then the atmosphere can hold more moisture. So yes, the projections are showing that PMP can increase. But that change may be less than a more frequent return, a 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100 year intense rain event. Those changes could be greater than the changes at the extreme ends of PMP. So it's important to look at it all together, and that's why the first stage is identifying your risk and what you're designed to, that load in terms of the probability. So it's an important consideration, but I think that's not necessarily the most vulnerable aspect of mine operations.